Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of the Paraspar lecture series, Science and Society. As some of you might know, Paraspar is an initiative of the Office of Communications, Indian Institute of Science, to open discussions around knowledge systems. How does knowledge emerge? What is the process and background? These are some of the questions that we would like to discuss and, begin a discussion and around these types of questions. Uh, as part of this initiative, from today we are beginning the new series, which will discuss science as a knowledge system vis-a-vis the society. We are very happy that the inauguration lecture of this series is going to be delivered by our colleague at the Office of Communications, Dr. Samira Agnihotri. To give you a brief introduction of the speaker today, Samira has worked in the Biligiri Rangan Hills from 2005 when she began to study birdsong while pursuing a master's degree in wildlife biology and conservation from the National Center of Biological Sciences. She then studied the vocal behavior and ecology of racket-tailed drongons for her PhD from the Indian Institute of Science. She followed up her research on drongons as a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. She is keenly interested in the documentation and preservation of the traditional uh, ecological knowledge of the Soliga indigenous community in collaboration with linguist Dr. Ong Shi. Samira is also interested in bioacoustics, oral histories, and alternative pedagogies. She is a member of Punarchip, a collective that works with farmers and rural youth in Chamrajanagar district. Currently, she works at the Office of Communication at Indian Institute of Science. So this is a little brief discussion about our very brilliant colleague, and we are very proud to have her today to begin this series. We'll take the questions at the end of the lecture. We can unmute yourself when I call out your name, or you can just type in your question in the chat box and I'll read them out. So Samira.
Thanks so much, Vitasta, and thanks to the Office of Communications for giving me this opportunity to talk about something very close to my heart. And I'm going to turn my video camera off before I share screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. So thanks again. And I'll start off by explaining a little bit about how ecological research is done. Perhaps everybody who's here may not know. Research that involves fieldwork, especially in ecology, often means going to remote forested, pristine landscapes where one might walk transects or lay camera traps to monitor wildlife or lay vegetation plots to monitor plant diversity and so on. Different types of data collection methods. And very often this is rendered possible only with the help of local community members who do not only carry our equipment and show us the very species or sites that we are interested in, but also keep an eye out for dangerous situations or encounters with other wildlife such as elephants and sloth bears. These landscapes that we call remote are actually home to people who live there and are not pristine but have been managed by humans for centuries. My remote and pristine field site has been the Biligiri Rangan Hills, which is home to a community that call themselves the Soliga. In these Soliga were hunter-gatherers and practiced shifting cultivation earlier, but are now resettled in small hamlets called Podus. BR Hills reached iconic status a few years ago when it became the only reserve to also have people within it. And in the next few slides, I'll give some examples of how their knowledge system, juxtaposed with mine, can lead to different types of insights. So for example, here this tree on the right is perhaps a very large forest species to me, to my eyes. Maybe I can identify the species and I'll say it's a champaka tree, but it's the central deity of the Soliga people, and they call it Dodisampige, big Sampige tree, and they worship it, and it's very important for their community. I'll just quickly try to play a recording from one of their festivals where they are invoking their various forest deities to come. If I can try to play it, yes. So that was just an example of some of their folk songs. Here is another example of two different knowledge systems in one place. This is a map of the Biligiri Rangan Hills, or the BRT Tiger Reserve. The outline of the map is perhaps, from a Western scientific outline given by outsiders. But all the dots that you see in this map that was created by ATRI, which is an NGO in Bangalore, these dots represent the sacred sites of the Soliga community. And these sacred sites take different forms, but perhaps the most important for them are two types of sites. One is where they bury their dead, which is called a sagga, and another site where the soul of the person who is buried is placed in their clan sacred site in the form of a stone. And this sacred site, which is separate as a separate physical space from the burial site, is called Kallugudi. And there are 5 clans amongst the Soliga. Each of them have their own set of different sacred sites all over the landscape. And so using these two knowledge systems, this map represents the deep connect of the community to the landscape of BR Hills. When I first went to the BR Hills in 2005 as a master's student, I was studying different species. I was recording the calls of different species of birds. And I've always been accompanied by Soliga people during all my research. And I had to learn the names of the birds in their language, which is not Kannada. It's a different dialect at the very least. And I learned this during my masters, because I had to interact with them. They showed me where different birds are found and so on and so forth. And then I went on to do my PhD on this one species of bird known as the racket-tailed drongo, which you can hopefully see on your screens. And again, I was always accompanied by Soliga colleagues. At the same time, when I started my PhD, Ong Si, who's a linguist, he came to do his PhD on the language of the Soliga people. And this opened up a new realm, and a natural collaboration started because the first task that a linguist has to do is to make a dictionary of any new language that they are studying. And since I had the names of a few birds, I was able to provide the first few words for his dictionary. And of course, and then we went on to do a lot of more work together, which I'll talk about briefly. So since we had the list of bird names, we decided to explore the traditional knowledge of the Soliga people in relation to birds. How do they relate to the birds around them? And so we did a small project on the ethno-ornithology of the Soliga, where we went around and showed them photos and played the calls of different birds and asked them to name them or tell us stories about these different birds. And here are a few examples from what we found. To me, this is a black eagle, but to the Soliga, this is Kaan Katle, or the darkness of the evergreen forest. Kaan is evergreen forest, and Katle is, of course, darkness. Here is another bird known to me as the Malabar whistling thrush, and here's its call. So it's called Kan Gorava by the Soliga, which means the herder of the evergreen forest because of its whistling, human-like whistling qualities to its call. Here's another example, self-explanatory, I think. This is a Brahmini starling to us, or bird watchers or outsiders, and to them it's just combed head bird or talebasa. Here's another interesting example. These are two different species according to me. Black-shouldered kite on the left and a common kestrel on the right. But both of them have been given the same name by the Soliga, which is Giduga, which is based on the unique behavior of these two species of hovering in midair. There are no other species in the BR Hills that show this behavior, and that's why they are clubbed together to be known as Giduga. So in this case, the name for the bird comes from the behavior rather than what it looks like. But it's not just about bird names, right? The Soliga have mythological and cultural connections with birds that are part of their everyday life. For example, the calls of several woodpeckers are believed to be portents of danger, a dangerous animal on the path ahead, or even to signify the death of a community member in a faraway settlement. And I'll just try to play the calls that signify danger to the Soliga people. I'll play that again. I hope you can hear it. That's the call of a rufous woodpecker. And that's a flameback woodpecker. And this third call, made by flameback woodpeckers, is believed to signify no danger or a clear path ahead. So here the woodpecker is saying illa 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 illa, and you can go ahead. And this is such a strong belief amongst the community that whenever they hear the woodpeckers calls that signify danger, they immediately make another call in response to hearing the bird's call that is thought to pacify the woodpecker and be an acknowledgement of their warning. So, for example, when they hear this call, they will immediately respond with a click whistle, which is to pacify the bird. And again, these are woodpeckers to me, but they call them marakutka, but also Sivan Hakki or Shiva's bird or Kari Hakki, the calling bird, the herald. Yeah. Oops. Yeah. What about the greater racket-tailed drongo, the bird that I have been following for so many years? It's called Dod Karali by the Soliga. Karali is any drongo, and Dod Karali is just big drongo. But interestingly, it's also known as the Kolukara or the stick wielder or the policeman of the bird community. And the Soliga say that it looks after the birds, it protects them, but it also takes the bribe of one feather from each bird. And perhaps this observation, this term Kolukara and all these observations came from their own observations of the bird's behavior within what I know as mixed species flocks. It's also a naturally aggressive bird and it doesn't hesitate to chase away larger birds of prey such as owls and eagles. And even though they didn't know about its mimicking abilities, which I studied, they knew about its behavior within mixed species flocks, right? Here's another example, and I'll try to play a recording here.
ಕೋಕುಜಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಅದೊಂದು ಶಾಸ್ತ್ರ ರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ ಅದು ಭೂಮಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕೋಹೋ 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 ಅಂತ ಕೂಗಿದರೆ ಮಳೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಅಂತೇಳಿ. ಅದು ಹಾರಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕೂಗಿದರೆ ಅದು ಮಳೆ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಹಾರಾಟ.
So this person is talking about this bird that I know is the slaty-legged crake, which is a common but elusive and hard to spot bird that is found near freshwater streams in forests. And they call it the kokunji. And he's saying that the kokunji, when it calls in a certain way, koho koho, it means that it will rain a lot and when it calls like that from near the ground. But when it calls in a different way and it's flying up high, then it won't rain as much. And this is true because this bird breeds in the monsoon and it makes a very specific breeding call only during the monsoon, which is that koho koho call. And the rest of the year it makes some guttural and not so noticeable sounds, very different from its breeding calls. And so this was interesting. Again, they have their name and their observations are, they have linked it to the onset of the monsoon, right? And I'll come back to this bird towards the end of this talk today. Here's another example, and here I'd like to tell a small story. When we are doing the ethno-ornithology work, there were already papers and articles written about the BR Hills, that it's very strange in that it doesn't have certain species of birds which are otherwise common across the Western Ghats. And one such group of birds were hornbills. There were no hornbills reported by bird watchers or bird surveys in the BR Hills. Several such surveys that had been conducted over many years, but by outsiders. And when we were doing the ethno-ornithology work, during that time in one of the towns in the foothills, I was with my Soliga friends, and we saw a grain hornbill, which is a common bird in across India, even in farmlands. And he immediately said, "This is nare." So I asked him, "Oh, what do you mean this is nare?" He said, "Yeah, that's our name for this bird." And do you know, when I was a small child, when I was a young boy and I was walking in the forest with my father, one day I saw a huge nare bird, and I could hear its wings make a loud sound, and it came and sat near a branch in front of us, and it had a beak over a beak, and we call it dodnare. So that was very interesting for me because nobody had ever reported any hornbills from the BR Hills. And then it turns out in 2017, the same boy, who is a grown-up man now, who took this photo of an Indian hornbill in BR Hills. And then we got really excited because we had seen it again, and it was not just a matter of folklore, but it was happening in real life. So we went around and asked a lot of people and showed them the photo of the great Indian hornbill, and we asked them specifically, what do you call its name and what do you know about it? And everybody said Dodnare, and everybody even provided more ecological information about the exact locations where they had seen this bird in history, in the past, in their lifetimes, and the kinds of fruits it eats. And one person we interviewed had even seen a nest when he was a teenager. And so this was a revelation. The hornbills may not be very common in the BR Hills, but they've obviously been there long enough to have been given a name by the Soliga, right? And this was only possible, this rediscovery was only possible because we had a name to ask them about. I mean, all the other bird surveys were done by outsiders who were using English names, and since they hadn't seen hornbills earlier, they just didn't ask the people who lived there for many years whether these birds were present or not. And here's some more examples. So to me, this is just different shades of green in this picture, and maybe different colors of bark. But to the Soliga, who consider the forest their home, they have to navigate their way through it, and the way they do it is by naming every single patch of forest. So like we give addresses, like we have addresses in the cities to get from one place to another, they've identified the forest by giving every different place a name. Even single trees have names. For example, the black tree that you see in front in the center is called Huli Harid Honne, tiger jump honne tree. And the story goes is how it got its name because somebody was passing by and they saw a tiger resting on the lower branch. And as soon as it saw the person, it jumped off. So tiger jump honne tree. Just the name of this tree contains multiple types of information. So from the name, we know that there are tigers in this area. We know that the species of tree, it is honne. What I know is Pterocarpus marsupium. And we know that tigers can climb trees. And when we went closer to this tree, we saw fresh and old tiger scratch marks as well. So the tigers are still using this tree, right? So just in the name of the place name given to this tree by the Soliga, there is a lot of ecological information that can be gleaned out of it. Similarly, what looks in this photo, what I see are Shola grasslands, an endangered forest habitat. But to them, this is a sacred site where a great battle occurred when their family god Madeshwara or Madesura, who lives in the MM hills, killed the evil demon Savana. Every hill, every piece of this landscape is connected to the story of this battle. For example, there is a boulder called Oragukallu or leaning boulder where the god has thought to have leaned and rested during the battle. There is a Savanana array, which is a rocky boulder where the demon was killed, where rituals are conducted till today to commemorate this great battle. So to them, this is a sentient landscape. The landscape is alive. Coming back to rackettail rongos, my colleagues and I saw them perching on the bark of the tree that they were nesting in during my PhD and postdoctoral years, and we assumed that they were eating ants. But in 2017, when I got a zoom camera, I got a camera with a really good zoom, we were able to take this video, which I'll try to play. So after we took this video, we wondered what it is that they were doing. They were clearly not eating ants, but they seemed to be scraping the bark of the tree with their beaks. And we discussed this a lot, my Soliga colleagues and I. When I discussed it with these two friends of mine who have been my companions through most of my research in the BR Hills, they pointed out that the drongos were smoothening the bark to deter predators from climbing up. Not only that, they also pointed out that the species of trees that the drongos use to nest on are already smooth barked. And they knew this because they climb these trees and they need to make footholds in order to climb these particular species as their bark is already really slippery, right? And this insight, which is perhaps new to science, was only possible because of our combined knowledge systems, because of our combined intellectual contributions. And this was published in a recent paper where we documented this new behavior shown by this bird. And this has implications not just for the ecology of this species, but for the cognitive abilities of birds, and also for really deep interactions between birds and the trees that they nest on, right? So it's important in multiple ways. Here's another ongoing project in collaboration with the Punarchit, where we're trying to understand the Soliga perspectives on changing climate patterns or the climate emergency. Typically, research on climate change is done by collecting long-term data on weather patterns from satellite data. But these people who have been living there for centuries also have their own long-term observations. And all the people we've spoken to so far have have observed a reduction in rainfall and in the number of rainy days. They also expressed an increase in heat and a reduction in the amount of honey and lichens that they collect as sources of income, and also in coffee yields, which are dependent on rainfall patterns. They most importantly, they also observed a reduction in natural indicators of rainfall. For example, the calls of the kokunji bird that I had mentioned earlier. Everybody said the kokunji is calling much less. The honey is much more the viscosity of the honey is changing because of the changing rainfall, and that there were mismatches between seasonal cycles that they have observed. For example, the uh, eruption of certain types of mushrooms that coincided with the flowering of specific tree species. So the trees are flowering, but the mushrooms are not there, or the mushrooms are there, but the trees are not flowering. And according to here are a few quotes. Overall, the forest seems confused to them, and they say in the months of May and June, we would be covered in blankets and sitting by a fire. Now it's difficult to even wear the clothes on our back due to the heat. And that elephants and other animals also must come near us, as there is no water in the forests. Even for our own rain making rituals, we need to carry water in a can. So they also have these rituals to appease the gods to ensure a bountiful monsoon. And typically they would use water from a stream for those rituals, but that's not possible in many years nowadays. And even those rituals don't seem to be working, as a few of them have expressed. Similarly, we talk about biodiversity loss, right? And in Bihar Hills, the biodiversity loss is because of a combination of factors, not just the changing climate, but also the spread of an invasive weed known as lantana. But how do you measure biodiversity loss? For that, you need to know what was there earlier. And the Soliga know that, right? They are witness to this change. And so when we ask them, they have named at least 140 plant species, small herbs included, that are of edible value to humans and animals, and also of medicinal and cultural value to the Soliga themselves, that are now locally extinct and remain only in the place names and folklore of their knowledge system. For example, the plant on the bottom right with the pink flowers is called Maveri, and there is a place known as Maveri Gadde. But when you actually go to Maveri Gadde, there is no Maveri there, only lantana. And similarly, the white flower on the left bottom is Nelakki, and Nelakki is now found only in their song cycles, and earlier it would be very common in the forest. Here's another example of different knowledge systems meeting. This is from Australia, scientists studying lizards who collaborated with indigenous rangers. And this graph just shows that the indigenous rangers were able to spot the lizards from further away than the scientists, in thicker vegetation, in lower light conditions, and even when the lizards were not moving as compared to the scientists. And therefore, this collaboration led to a different research outcome for this project. And all of these examples that I've given so far, including mine, are all to our benefit, or to my benefit, to in quotes science's benefit. And therefore this is somewhat extractive in nature, this behavior. But and perhaps it's not always possible to reduce this inequity this imbalance, in the give and take of knowledge. But one way could be by acknowledging the knowledge systems in themselves in the authorship, as this paper has done, where they credit the Balangara Rangers, and as perhaps I tried to do in my the paper that I talked about recently. Here's the crux. This map, the orange in this map shows the areas of highest language diversity and highest biodiversity in the world, right? This is combined together. This is known as biocultural diversity. The languages have co-evolved with the biodiversity. The traditional ecological systems in these regions have co-evolved with this biodiversity, and therefore they contain a wealth of information about all of this. And many species, as I had said earlier, that are assumed as new to science or new discoveries, of the locals here always knew about them, and in many cases have shown them to the scientists. So the take-home message here is that in order to conserve biodiversity, it is equally important to conserve traditional knowledge systems. Yeah. And before ending, just a couple of slides. To reiterate, science does not occur in a bubble. It itself is a social construct, right? Even lab work is enabled by a team of people that look after the animals or maintain cultures and so on. And it is not unaffected by economics, politics, and other aspects of society. Learnings across multiple disciplines lead to newer insights. For example, I learned a lot about my own work from anthropological perspectives and linguistic perspectives of looking at something. Traditional knowledge systems have been ignored or even extinguished by Western science, which has even become the mainstream now. Let's not propagate colonial frameworks and in our own practice. Hello, yeah, in our own practice, there's an urgent need for a dialogue between multiple ways of knowing, so that we can work towards a more informed and more democratic approach to research, especially that involving fieldwork. And it's not just about their traditional knowledge, right? It's also about our own traditional knowledge. How many bird names or plant names do we know that our grandparents knew? And perhaps when we talk about nature deficit syndrome and how we need to reconnect with nature, perhaps one way to do that would be to reconnect with our own traditional knowledge systems and remember those. And just before I end, this is a breathtaking photograph to most of us of an endangered species, but to the Soliga, this is more important and endangered and perhaps more breathtaking. This is a video of a honeybee collecting pollen from a grass flower, a site which is truly endangered due to the various ecological changes in the VR hills, and very important to the well-being of the ecosystem and the people who live there. I am going to stop sharing. And it's open for questions.
Thank you, Samira. It was a very apt opening to the series, and it was a delight for the eyes and the ears to listen to such, beautiful bird songs. So we can take questions. You may type in the chat box, or you can just, unmute yourself and let me just raise your hand. I'll call out your names, and you can unmute yourself then. Is there any question?
Okay, 0 questions. Either I spoke too clearly or too befuddlingly.
I think you spoke too clearly.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think there's a question by Priya. Priya, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Yeah,
you.
that was a wonderful talk, Samira. Thank you so much. So I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on something you mentioned in passing, that this need not be extractive or exploitative in terms of who contributes or who benefits whom, right? Like in most of the examples you mentioned, that it's mostly the traditional knowledge that is benefiting um, the more formal scientific way of looking at things. Um, do you have suggestions or ways forward where it could be more mutual?
Thanks, Priya. Yeah, as I mentioned, it may not always be possible, but at least, first of all, at least we should be aware of, the one-way traffic that's going on. But perhaps if we feel that this, our, research or any particular project would not have been possible without the help or the assistance of the local communities, then perhaps we should think about acknowledging that contribution in ways that are different from just a name in the acknowledgement section of a publication. As I had mentioned, perhaps giving them co-authorship, of course, with their consent. And I don't know if it's possible, then perhaps give back in other ways to the community. In our case, we have, we've made a dictionary and we've given it back to the community, and we are trying very hard to make sure that this traffic is not one way anymore, this exchange of knowledge. But I don't have all the answers, Priya, but all I'm saying is that at least we should be aware that there is this inequity, and think of ways in our own, in each of our, individual workspaces to try and change that.
We can take the next question. Yeah, Usha, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hi, Samira. Very nice talk. Very engaging, both visually and for listening, just like what Vitasta said. I was just very curious about the very last video. You showed a honeybee collecting pollen from grasses.
Yes.
Yeah, is that very usual? Because grasses usually disperse by wind, and here is a really striking example of an insect coming and feeding on the grass pollen. So is that common, or is it specific to that species of grass?
Oh no, so in the BR Hills, apparently, according to all Soliga, it used to be a very common sight. As when, yeah, but no longer, because the grasses have become very rare now. Yeah, it used to be very common.
Or the grasses are flowering at a time when the bees are not there? Is there some
Oh no, the bees
disconnect?
are there. The grasses are not there because of the weed lantana, which has overtaken
Okay.
the understory.
Yeah, that I know.
Yeah.
I was just curious about the insect feeding on the grass pollen.
Yeah, it's
That's a
apparently very common.
okay. Great.
Thank you for your question.
Chinari, may I ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Samira, that was a really wonderful presentation. Very, very interesting. I joined somewhat late, so I'm sorry if this is sort of repetitive. But I was wondering, so in the when you say that there are, of course there are these different knowledge systems, and there is it's important to build a dialogue between the two. Did you come across or were you put in a position where that sort of a dialogue was not really that possible? What I'm trying to ask is that there is that did you come across a sort of a knowledge or something that the people who you were interacting with knew that was very difficult to explain in your sort of understanding of a knowledge system? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I understand your question, but there is a lot of things that science can't explain that the Soliga believe. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I'll try to, given what I think I've understood it as. So, for example, the woodpeckers that are portents of danger, I'm often asked if it is true, because this is not something that any other knowledge system talks about. Woodpecker calls being the heralding danger, and my answer is that I wouldn't know. I cannot answer that because it is true to the Soliga, and typically they wouldn't keep on walking to find out whether there is truth to the bird's call or not. They would leave that area, right? So it when I talk about dialogue between knowledge systems, I also mean that one knowledge system doesn't necessarily have all the tools to be able to describe the other, and vice versa, right? But the whole point is to at least be open to listen to the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was asking. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello.
Yeah, please ask the question, Mr. Gopal Krishna.
Yeah, I'm Gopal Krishna Hegde. I'm basically from North Canada and Western Ghats somewhere. It's not a question, maybe I can put it this way. I think the idea you propose is because in such situations when you are getting information about this kind of either ecology, forestry, or whatever it is, definitely there will be a lot of contribution from the local people or tribals, or even in North Canada we'll see a lot of Siddhis. I really appreciate this proposal that they should be acknowledged, because a lot of information you get from the local people who are really doing their life over there. I really appreciate this talk and the proposal. I think that's not my comment. Hello?
Thank you very much, Mr. Hegde. Thank you for your comment. Hello.
Oh, I was in mute. Pyre IISc, I see that as your username. Can you ask a question? Unmute yourself and ask. Hello.
Yeah, good evening and thanks for a wonderful talk, Samira. Priya, who asked the first question, happens to be my daughter. I thought when she asked the question, I would also ask. A wonderful talk. And I've been working in this knowledge sharing and knowledge management in general areas, but more in a corporate setup from the management studies department at IISc. My question is, whenever we have this knowledge sharing and knowledge creation system, one question always asked by the stakeholders is, what is in it for me, right? So if I want to share knowledge with somebody, there must be some incentive for me to share knowledge, even within an organization, whether it's a NASA or ISRO or a company or whatever. Right? So I'm surprised that you find that there are local people who are sharing knowledge so unselfishly. I'm wondering, don't they ask themselves, what is in it for us? Shouldn't we get something back for the knowledge that we are sharing? And I think that leads up to the conclusion you are coming to towards the end, Samira, that we need to be able to give back to those systems, the traditional systems of knowledge, from which we are drawing so much knowledge. I think then it's a win-win situation. Otherwise, it becomes exploitative and commercial, and we go use the knowledge and use it for ourselves, and they get nothing back in return. I don't know if my comment or question makes sense. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. And Yeah, so I don't know if we can say unselfishly, because there is money that exchanges hands. So perhaps we feel that it's enough compensation for taking, for using the knowledge. At least that's the framework that we work within currently. And of course, that's not enough. And now in a place like BR Hills, where where so much research has happened and where hundreds of interviews have been conducted, people are asking back, I'm telling you all this, but my life hasn't changed one bit. Why should I even talk to you? So it's changing now, and really, perhaps once the community themselves, demand a more balanced relationship in the way that research is conducted, perhaps that's when we will really see this change. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Okay, I think there are no more questions.
Sure.
One second, I see something in the chat box. Professor Kaushal Verma has asked a question. Are there any other bird animals that smoothen the bark of the tree for this purpose?
Not that we know of. Not at all.
Okay. Okay, shall we call it a day then, Samira?
Sure. Thank you so much, Vitaka and Office of Communications, for providing this chance.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you so much. As I said, that this is a very apt, opening to the series, and we look forward to many more lectures. And I hope all of you will join us in the next lectures also. Thank you so much, Samira.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thanks to everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.